Thank you. Good afternoon. If I could ask those people, are there any seats available over here? Those who want to find seats who've just come into the room, there are some seats available over on this end. If you can make your way over, that would be terrific. And a very, very good afternoon to you all. My name is Dumi Makabo, and we hope that during the next hour and a half or so, we're going to take you on a journey. And I think it's a personally interesting journey, but before we do any of that, as I'm sure you know, you've been to enough conferences and panel discussions to know that there are some housekeeping rules that have to be adhered to. Now, I used to be able to say to people that you had to turn your mobile phone off. The good news is that I'm not going to ask you to turn the mobile phone off, because I know that there are some of you who don't know where the off button is. So for those of you who don't know where the off button is, don't worry. Just put it on silent and vibrate, which I suspect it already is. And remember, this session isn't just in this room, it is also going live online. And I say online because we also want people who are watching to be able to participate. So to all of you in your offices, please make sure the volume is low, because the boss will be upset with you. Before we do anything else, though, while we are talking about online, just a little image that I'd like to share with you. The next one. Switch off your mobile phone because Obama is listening. Okay, that was really funny. Come on. All right. So before you do any of that, remember that you can tweet. If you pay attention while we're speaking, at the bottom of the screen, you will see a number. In case you don't tweet or don't know how to tweet, there is an SMS number. So you send an SMS like you would send to the kids, and you click send to the number, and it'll get to us. Those of you who do tweet, please take note of the hashtag, because we want to have this be a conversation, not just amongst myself and my panelists behind me, but of course all of you in the room and all of those who are watching either at home or in their offices. And throughout the session, we of course will be monitoring your questions, which I will then be able to put on the screen and put to the panelists. Now, the reason I'm standing is actually because I'm a little bit hyper, so I'm not very good when I have to sit down. A little bit later on, I will, though, actually step off this platform and join you on the floor. But before we get to any of that, you did notice a very distinguished panel of guests joining us this afternoon to discuss this very, very pertinent question. Will a rights-based approach make development more human? To join us in this conversation, and yes, having done enough of these, I know that protocol does have to be observed. So, Mrs. Fawzia Yusuf Adam, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister of Somalia. To you, Madam, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome. Heidi Hautala, former Minister of International Development of Finland and former Chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Human Rights. To you, good to see you again, and welcome. Ignacio Saiz, Executive Director at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Ignacio, the only gentleman this evening, so thank you very much for joining us. And no, we won't make you wear makeup and a skirt. And Margaret Wachenfeld, who is Director of Legal Affairs at the Institute of Human Rights and Business. Margaret, to you, a very warm welcome, and thank you for joining us. Now, as I mentioned, you have the sense that this is quite a technical interaction that we have here. And I know that there are some of you who will have looked at the title of this session and thought, what on earth? For those of you who didn't think that, just ignore it. The question now is, will a rights-based approach make development more human? But I want you to actually vote. So, if we can have the information for the Twitter feeds and the SMS line, because I want people to have their information up there. You can see it. Can you all see that? Can everybody see that? Okay, let me read it, because I suspect not everybody can see it. Okay, if you can send EDD13C followed by your message to +33633133404 if you're going to SMS. Can I have that info back up again, please? It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. All right, it's not coming yet. When you get that up on the screen, please make note of the hashtag because I want you to vote. There are three options, either a yes or a no or a I don't know. And the question is exactly the title of this session. Will a rights-based approach make development more human? Once again, will a rights-based approach make development more human? Once you see the info back up on the screen, please make sure that you send your vote either yes or no or I don't know to the numbers that you see at the screen. We're going to do an interesting exercise today because at the very end of the session, we're going to put the question to you again to see whether indeed you have migrated from your initial position to the position at the end of the session. A little bit different, I know, so let's see how that goes today. Let's get this discussion then underway. It is indeed a significant question, and before we say anything else, when we think back to when this journey began, the question of a rights-based approach to development, I think it would be safe to say that the road was a little bit bumpy. At the very start, you could say that some people used a band-aid or a quick fix to the problem because what they figured they could do was they could just give different programs and different initiatives a rights-based name. Okay, so you're wondering, what am I saying? Okay, health programs, programs known as health programs, then became survival rights programs. Programs based on education or child protection then became development rights programs. So the substance or the content of the programs didn't change. The only thing initially that changed was the name, because now we included the word rights. Thankfully, I'm very pleased to say that we've moved away from the early 90s and we're now in 2013 and can have this discussion about rights. So if I could come to the Deputy Prime Minister then of Somalia to begin with. Madam, we all know and recognize that when we're talking about war and we're talking about conflict, not only is it a negative impact on infrastructure, not only is it a negative impact on the way people perceive or understand situations, there is a material impact on how they engage. In the context of your country, how are you grappling with the question of making rights-based development a priority when in reality there are some significant infrastructure needs at play? How do you do that?
Thank you. Is it on?
Yes, it is.
Rights-based approach to development is absolutely critical. In the context of Somalia, which is emerging from 23 years of conflict where rights were abused left and right, rape was used as a weapon of war, properties were confiscated by warlords. There was no development. Based on that conflict and mayhem during this very long time, there was no way to focus on development. There was no way to do construction, rehabilitation of schools, health services, employment, which is another right. It's absolutely important and critical to have peace, to get development. And it's important to have development, to have peace. And without both, as a former Secretary General said, without human rights, you cannot have both. So Somalia has suffered, but Somalia is emerging from that now and is working very hard. The center point of our priorities is human rights. And in fact, we have established in February the first Commission of Human Rights in Somalia, where the special envoy from the Human Rights Geneva has actually applauded our activities and has told the world that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now Somalia is emerging from that, and peace, stability, and human rights is taking root.
It's one thing for you to say rights is important for us in Somalia, but In fact, how are you actually making sure that you're incorporating that? Because we have heard before where people say, yes, rights are important, yes, we need to do all of this, but taking that from something you say to something you actually do is quite a different challenge.
We are, as I said, we have formed our Commission for Human Rights, actually in February, and it's working very hard in all over the country and all over the regions. Yes, we have issues such as terrorism and other abuses taking place, but we are fighting it. So the government is, one of the priorities is actually to address this very serious issue, and it is taking place, and we are very proud of coming out today and saying, look, we are working on our human rights issues and the developments taking place finally.
Heidi, if I can come to you, in reality, is this notion of human rights being married to development actually reconcilable?
Sorry, human rights and?
In the context of development, are they
Okay.
actually reconcilable?
I think human rights must be perceived both as a goal of development and as a means to achieve development. I think it is very much reconcilable. I even believe that the modern world is now coming to an understanding there can be no development without a full incorporation of the various aspects of human rights into development policy. And it can be done in practice. It's very encouraging to see that organizations are learning organizations, and it's possible to put in place toolboxes, ideas for implementation, so that it's not just empty words, because that's definitely what it should not be.
How do you translate that? When you say that's definitely not what it should be, it should definitely not be words, we're not necessarily hearing that for the first time.
That's true, but I believe that the overwhelming majority of development actors are now realizing that it's high time to see what human rights-based approach means in practice. Our government, during my period as Minister for International Development, created a kind of a guideline on implementation of human rights-based approach, and we're very happy to share it with anyone who wants to. It's publicly available on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it shows that it is possible indeed to start from the very simple realization that human rights-based approach means that those who are responsible for implementation and guaranteeing people's rights must be made aware of those obligations. And on the other hand, the so-called rights holders, people, development work can help them to understand their rights better. And this is a kind of an interesting interaction which then can create into a new way of conceiving development.
Ignacio, if I can come to you, economic and social rights on the one hand, civil and political rights on the other hand, disconnect. This is obviously a space that you occupy and do a lot of work in. How is that something, one, that can be bridged? And for those of us, perhaps explain to us why there is this significant disconnect, because one would have assumed that it would have been something that was readily doable, but seemingly not.
You're right, Tumi, that there's been a... Oh, is this on? Yeah.
Yep.
You're right that there's been a historical divide between civil and political rights on the one hand and social, economic and cultural rights on the other. That historical divide is really something from the times of the Cold War, with the so-called West championing civil and political rights and the communist bloc championing primarily economic, social and cultural. That was 20 years ago, and in 20 years ago this year, the international community met together at the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights and resoundingly put an end to that divide. It kind of brought the Berlin Wall down between civil, political, and social, economic, and cultural rights by affirming that these rights were all human rights were truly indivisible and interdependent and mutually reinforcing, and that therefore they had to be given the same emphasis. In those 20 years since then, there has been enormous progress in redressing the historical neglect of economic, social, and cultural rights, Many countries now have them protected in their constitutions. They have been enforced and claimed in jurisdictions around the world. But still, we're seeing, to some extent, a false dichotomy between these two sets of rights. In the post-2015 context, for example, the MDGs, on the one hand, the MDGs were have been very neglectful of civil and political rights. Ironically, those rights were missed out of the agenda. And economic and social issues in the MDGs, like health, education, housing, were not really treated as rights issues. They were there more as development issues rather than matters of rights, and that makes a difference. And so this time around, with the post-2015 agenda, we have an opportunity to really make that marriage whole and to ensure that the new agenda covers a balanced framework, including freedoms of speech, freedoms of expression, information, association, which are so crucial as an enabling environment for development, but also ensuring that any new commitments on health, education, housing, water, and sanitation are fully aligned with existing international human rights standards on those issues. And that's critical.
Critical, Margaret, if I can come to you, before we even get to the process of the reality that there is a sector or a private sector business in the midst of all of this, trying to make it happen within that context. Before we even get there, when we are talking about this bridging between the question of economics or social and political, Ignacio gave us a sense of the historic reasons for why that is the divide. But one would have equally thought, and maybe Ignacio, we can have your thoughts on this as well, one would have thought that in this day and age, the point of departure for many would be, is this a rights issue? Does this address the rights issue as well as take care of the development aspect? And it's a little bit disconcerting, I think, for some, that it doesn't seem that that happens quite readily, Margaret. Your views on that? Yeah, how do the two come together when you're in fact trying to bridge something that for all intents and purposes many would have assumed was obvious?
I think you walk out the door is what you do.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, is that not, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I think you walk out the door and you go and you look and you see what's happening just outside your own door, and you find that in reality, even here in Europe, whether it's Europe or it's the United States or it's other countries around the world, people are living in poverty. I spent a long time working on poverty issues here in Europe, and I think sometimes people forget there's poverty here. So people are missing out on their economic and social rights here, but you need a voice to be able to stand up and to talk about those. So what you do is you get together, you have a freedom of association to bring groups together, and you can speak about it, you can talk with governments about it, and you bring those rights together. And I think as the development community has gone out into the world and this maturity process has developed, as you talked about, you start to see the relevance of civil and political rights to health issues or to education issues, just as equally as the human rights community, which had been very focused on civil and political rights, as Ignacio was saying, has also seen that there are very important tools of building human rights into achieving economic, social, and cultural rights. So I think it's actually fairly obvious when you walk out the door and you open your eyes.
Yeah, it's fairly obvious. Ignacio, yeah, I see you chuckling as well. It's fairly obvious, but equally, as I indicated earlier, there is this thing called the private sector, and there is business. And with all due respect to a lot of business people, many of whom are my friends, yes, the reality of the matter is that it's about the bottom line. It's about how do you make money, it's about how do you maximize profit. In some instances, it's about how do you reduce your wage bill to such an extent that you can actually maximize those profits, particularly when you're looking at an environment as we're seeing currently globally where everything seemingly is shrinking. So the first point is how do we cut costs and make more money?
Right.
In that light, how do you then ensure that we are seeing a rights focus when business is having to operate in an environment where development is increasingly important?
So just as I think the development and the human rights... Sorry, what? You can't hear me.
Yeah, we need you closer to the
Closer
mic.
to the microphone, sorry. I'm just trying to figure out what those hand signals were. So just as the human rights community and the development community have learned this process and how they work together and reinforce each other, we're clearly seeing the business community globally go through that same learning process. And the business attention to the business impacts on human rights, it's about a 20-year-old discussion. It started with some iconic incidents that have started the world thinking about businesses' responsibility for their impacts on human rights. More recently, there's been a very concerted UN effort, a 6-year process, to have a global discussion around what business responsibility is with respect to human rights. And that process concluded recently with a framework called the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. And that sets out what government's role is with respect to regulating business. It sets out businesses' role, which is to respect human rights, and it sets out both of their roles with respect to providing remedy to victims of human rights abuse. So that process, and which took place through global conversations around the world, has helped to kickstart the thinking within the business community and has clarified what those responsibilities are. That's a start of the process, as you said. How do you marry up that issue around respect for human rights with this issue of profitability? There's some very interesting discussions going on. There's a lot of thinking, and I suppose we'll probably come back to this question, so I'll leave it at there for now.
Yeah, you were tempted to go. All right, as I indicated earlier, this is not just a conversation amongst those of us who are up here, but it's also a conversation amongst those of you in the room. One very important person in the room is a youth ambassador who I would like to stand up and share some thoughts with her. Where is she sitting? Oh, there you are. Vanessa Basile, who is a youth ambassador from Lebanon. And I think just looking at where you come from, it would be obvious to many that obviously that is the rights question, a key issue from where you come from. And I'd like for you to share some of your views and thoughts. If I could have a microphone up here for her. There she is.
So I'm Vanessa Basile. I'm a journalist and peace activist in Lebanon. And also I'm the founder and president of Media Association for Peace. So actually what I do is I use media as a power for development, for human rights, and for peace in Lebanon and the Middle East and North Africa region. So for me, as a youth ambassador in this conference, I'm here to represent especially also the women who would like to play a role in public affairs and in civil society, and especially also the women who wants to play a role in media. And for me, media is a very powerful tool and actually to achieve what we're talking about in this particular panel. So in order to make development in developing countries, we actually need to raise awareness and educate people through media outlets in order to reach development.
When we're talking about educate people, the people that you've interacted with, the people that you are working with in your space, what is it that you are hearing from them about what needs to be done to address this particular rights issue? What are they saying to you?
Well, actually, they blame politics.
They blame politics.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the government. So usually this is what I hear from them. And I think that the main problem is in politics, but I think, in my opinion, that the problem also comes from the society and from the citizens themselves. Because in Lebanon, at least, we are the one who vote for the government, and we are the one who elect our deputies. So we are also responsible of what's going on.
And what has been the response when you say that to people, that you're just as responsible? Granted, that's a very broad statement, because there are many people who are in spaces where they're not responsible for their rights predicament. But in this instance where people feel empowered, what do they say when you say to them, you're partly responsible? What is the response?
Actually, they say that if we do not vote to those political leaders, we cannot eat.
They cannot eat?
Yes.
Huh, interesting. Okay, well, I'd like to hear a little bit, thank you very much, Vanessa. I'd like to hear a little bit from the panelists, and perhaps, Madame Faizia, if I could come to you. Without saying that you're responsible for all politicians, because I know you're not, the reality is that so often when this debate comes up, the first place to blame is the political space. Vanessa makes a valid point to say that there has to be a recognition for people that they're equally responsible for the situation. How are you trying to straddle that in an environment where tensions are very high, conflict is very recent, people's emotions are therefore severely affected by their recent history? How do you sensitize people to the sense that you're just as responsible in changing the future as politicians?
In the case of my country, due to the long-term conflict, a very strong civil society emerged, which have been almost running the country for so long, doing all the responsibilities of a government in terms of supporting the communities with aid, with education, with health services, and the likes. We therefore use the media a lot. We also consult with civil societies, leaders of the communities, and in our culture there is a tribal strength where there are tribal leaders who are also consulted. So what we do is collectively talk and discuss issues, and from there on decide where to start to convince and or to reach the grassroots and groups who are, in that situation. So it is a collection of different strategies we use, from tribal leaders to media to discussions with the civil societies, and we have a very strong youth groups also who are listened to. Thank you.
Ignacio, if I could have your response. You sit in a space where you're touching numerous points. I think the challenge we have with that microphone is, can I ask you to give that one to Margaret, and then you take that one, so when Margaret speaks we can actually hear her. You sit in a space where you have a number of touch points with civil society, with policymakers, and so on. This question of taking responsibility for the enforcement, promotion of the development of the rights question in the context of development, how are you experiencing that, number one? And how are you managing to change the dialogue, if at all, in terms of how people take ownership of that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking a lot at the question of accountability, responsibility. I think in this post-2015 context, one of the biggest shortcomings of the current MDG framework is it talked about shared responsibility. At times in development forums, you heard the language of mutual responsibility or mutual accountability. But accountability has been very weak, and it's been diffuse and somewhat skewed as well. Wherever there has been talk of accountability, it's tended to be the accountability of developing governments or governments in developing countries to their donors. And really what accountability is about from a human rights perspective is accountability primarily of those in power, of governments and others who hold power, towards their citizens or towards individuals and communities. And we have to move towards that vision of accountability. I guess to answer your question succinctly, I would say that one of the biggest challenges for this new agenda, or in the new framework, is to identify responsibilities and accountabilities at every appropriate level. Under human rights standards, under human rights law, the primary duty bearer, the primary holder of obligations is the state, the national government, which is why we all put so much emphasis on lobbying our elected representatives. But the biggest accountability gaps in the MDG framework currently have actually been the accountability of actors above and beyond the state. By that I mean second governments, usually wealthier governments, the EU as a bloc, the accountability of second governments in conditioning or creating an enabling environment in which national governments can do the right thing in terms of investing in development. That needs to be looked at, and that hasn't been properly addressed. The accountability for that hasn't been properly addressed. And also the accountability of the corporate sector. And what Margaret has been talking about is critically important in this context, because the corporate sector is being encouraged to play an even more active role this time around as the engine of development. But with that responsibility and with that increased role must come increased accountability. And many of us coming from a civil society perspective who are all too aware of the harmful impacts that companies can sometimes have in certain contexts, in certain development contexts. We're very keen to see accountability strengthened, corporate accountability strengthened, particularly if there's going to be an increased role for the corporate sector.
Okay, just so you know, we're having a little bit of a technical challenge in terms of getting the Wisembly up and running. So we have one roving microphone on this side. Do we have another one on this side? Okay, we have two. I would like to, in the interim, open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question, remember to keep it brief. If you have a statement, remember to keep it even more brief. And remember to also introduce yourself so we know whom it is we're speaking with and have a better sense of dialogue. So just raise your hand and I'll keep an eye on the... Oh, there goes one already. And I'll keep an eye... Why is it whenever I do that, we get 5 hands going up? Okay, I've got 2 questions from the floor. That gentleman right over there, there's another one I need over here. And in the interim, I want to get Margaret talking a little bit about business while we get that microphone to that gentleman over there. Margaret, you stopped yourself a little bit earlier because you were going into this whole question of the responsibility of business. The argument can be made whether, business should be responsible. I mean, in keeping with what Ignacio was saying, many would say, well, it's the government's responsibility to provide certain rights protection environments, provided that businesses stick within the law and they don't break the law, then why should businesses have this particular headache? Why should businesses have this headache?
So fortunately, that question has already been settled. As I said, I think this 6-year-long process has settled. Governments absolutely have the responsibility to provide appropriate regulation. However, that's a perfect world, and we recognize that not everywhere is a perfect world, and very often business runs much faster than governments do, whether it's across borders or even within countries. And out of that has come the recognition that there are these governance gaps, particularly around companies, particularly companies that can cross borders, but not only. And so one of the really important things that came out of this discussion was this recognition that business does have a responsibility. It has a responsibility to follow the law, but if the law is not there, they still have a responsibility to meet human rights standards. So they shouldn't, even if the legal regulation is not there, their responsibility is to meet international human rights standards as a minimum. Now, has that message gotten all the way around the world? No, of course not. But there's a lot of work going on now. There's resistance, of course, on some saying the business of business is business. But I think there's a lot, but just that's a decreasing viewpoint with this new discussion that's going on business and human rights. And I think coming to the post-2015 agenda, what's clear is private sector has been clearly recognized as an important contributor to development in the 2015 discussions. Human rights has been recognized as a very important part of the 2015 agenda. What's not in there yet, and we're going to work hard, I'm sure all of us, to get it in there, is to marry those two agendas and to say that as business is going forward in the time now and in the post-2015 agenda, they should be doing so from this position of responsibility to respect human rights.
Heidi, I'm going to come to you in just a minute. I just want to take this one question from the floor. There's a gentleman right over here. Please remember to introduce yourself.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am Pankaj Kesi. I'm from Nepal, currently working in water aid. The world is being increasingly global and increasingly interconnected. at the same time, the huge inequalities exist between the countries and within the countries. So with that brief background, my question is, will a rights-based approach instead fuel the conflict, or has it got the potential to start the conflict?
Wow, that's a big one. You didn't get the question?
It's very hard to hear, actually.
Okay, okay. He wants to. I'm paraphrasing, and please correct me if I'm incorrect. He's saying that will a rights-based approach rather fuel or cause more conflict instead of eliminating the conflict? And Heidi, as a policymaker, I think that's an appropriate one for you to address.
Well, obviously there are conflicts of interests in terms of whose rights will be promoted. But then I believe that those who want to get engaged in pre or post conflict resolution must be very firm about their commitment to commonly agreed international standards. And I think one of the key principles which must be upheld is the non-discrimination and the equality. And especially I think everybody in development these days has to be aware how important it is to actively combat inequalities, not just pay lip service to equality, but to take measures that put the marginalized people in the center of activity, because they are often the ones whose rights are least defended. So there are conflicts of interest, and it's important to pay attention to the power balance in the society. But I can't really see, perhaps someone else can, that there might be some conflicts due to a human rights-based approach. Perhaps Fausia has some experience of a very difficult situation where that could happen.
Heidi, one area where I think one may find that there are some sensitivities to address, not necessarily conflict in that sense, but sensitivities, is around culture. One of the Twitter feed questions was, what about cultural sensitivities in trying to have this very broad application of these human rights inputs into development?
Yeah, I think this is a two-edged issue. I think it's absolutely necessary to develop sensitivity towards cultural differences, the way we people act due to our geographical, ethnic, cultural backgrounds and differences there. But I've also come to a situation, for instance, when I had this incredibly happy privilege to lead the Finnish delegation in the UN Human Rights Council, the Universal Periodical Review, which puts a country in turn under the investigation of others, the whole international community. And one recommendation that Finland got was that we should not condition our development aid against traditional values of a certain African country. And that was the only recommendation that we said no to. We agreed everything else on acting on violence against women, trying to combat hate speech in internet, and defending the rights of our indigenous Sami people. But this one we didn't want, because it would mean that very likely the victims of this kind of traditional cultural values would be, first of all, women, who don't always have rights of inheritance, rights on ownership of land, due to cultural traditional systems. And I know this is a very, very disputed issue, but I think we have to be very firm that there are two aspects to being sensitive to cultural differences.
Before I take another question from the floor, Madame Fausia, the cultural issue, as Heidi was alluding to, it can play a role in particularly in a process or at the point where you are trying to find frameworks with which to move forward on this issue. How are you addressing that when there is this desire to have a more broader, universal approach to the human rights question?
In where I am from, in my region, Somalia is a unique and different from other countries or developing countries, as we have one culture, one language, and 99% one ethnic group. There is therefore no issue with that. But inequality and lack of accessing resources causes the conflict in our area. We are therefore, after so long, trying to reach everyone and trying to respect the rights of everyone as government, so that people come back together and decide together. It is therefore not an issue for us. The cultural issue is not an issue for us to create a conflict. It is a matter of resources which caused all these conflicts in our case, if I got you right.
If we were looking, for example, at, well, let's take my country. I'm South African, so let's use that as an example. There are some cultural practices that have to do with female circumcision, for argument's sake. On the one hand, there are many people who would argue and say, this is our cultural practice, we have the right to do this, why shouldn't we? There are many who would come from the opposite angle and say, well, actually, there is a human rights violation issue in terms of this, right? And that directly impacts how you then potentially formulate your healthcare policy, how you formulate your gender policy, how you deal with the protection of women, even though culturally you're homogenous. Some of those cultures may be in direct conflict with what some view as the universal norm or the universal standard when it comes to human rights abuses. And that's more the question that I wanted for you to address.
Fortunately, in our culture, yes, there was this FGM that has been there for many centuries, but it is agreed upon across the line. It is agreed that it's not religious. Therefore, people are in the same line that this is unfair, that is a violation of human rights, and it has to stop. So there is no conflict in that aspect. It is accepted that it's a human rights violation, and a lot has been done about it. So there's no conflict in that area.
All right. There was another question from the floor. There was this lady who had her, I saw your hand, this lady with the red glasses who had her hand up a little bit earlier, and that lady in the yellow shirt who also had her hand up a lot earlier. If we could have a microphone here, please, and if we could have the second microphone to the lady in the yellow, please. Madame, please.
Hello, I'm Kate Horsted from Age International, part of the Help Age International network. You seem to all agree that the post-2015 framework should be based on rights for everyone. So I was wondering, some of the marginalised groups, such as older people, actually find it quite difficult to access some of the things that you've identified as rights, such as healthcare. So I was wondering how you think in practice we can ensure that everyone, whatever their age, has access to the same human rights.
Ignacio, can I have you address that when we're talking a little bit about the success story issue? Because I think that would address her question in part as well.
I think the lack of attention to inequality and to groups facing systemic disadvantage, like older persons, has been one of the biggest blind spots of the current MDG process. And it's had disastrous results. This current focus on aggregate level achievement has actually masked and papered over widening disparities. It's had a perverse incentives. I mean, in child mortality, for example, sorry, this isn't on the issue of aging, but child mortality has decreased in about 80% of countries, but in 2/3 of those countries, inequality between the richest 20% and the poorest 20% has widened. So it's an example of the risk of this aggregate level approach. We need a much more disaggregated approach. With regard to the rights of older persons, thanks, I think, to the active engagement of civil society movements and organizations such as the Help Age Network, these oversights, these very serious gaps in the current MDG framework are being addressed, I think, in the post-2015 discussions. And it's critically important that the rights of older people be visibly and cross-cuttingly addressed in the new commitments, as with the rights of disabled people, the rights of women, the rights of indigenous people, etc. the rights of older people, I mean, particularly given demographic changes in our current societies, are taking on increased relevance. There are huge issues here in Europe with regard to an aging population, declining pensions, particularly in countries undergoing very rigid austerity measures. And I think what can be done, well, I think since we're here at the heart of the EU, we can lobby EU institutions to take a more progressive and human rights-centered stance with regard to the rights of older people. There is a debate as to whether there should be a new instrument, a new convention on the rights of older persons, and it's governments of the EU, amongst others, that are against such an idea, perhaps because of the cost implications of really honoring older persons' rights in an aging continent and in a continent which is keen on fiscal austerity rather than the rights of older people. So my rant will end there, but that's a concrete thing that I think can be done.
Before your rant ends, there's a specific question. What differences can a rights-based approach make? Any examples of programs before and after? Can you give us one example of a before and... Yeah, you. Why not you?
Okay. I can give you an example of work that we have done with partners in different countries. Let me take the example of Guatemala, where we have partnered with organizations, development organizations, to address issues such as horrendously high rates of maternal death, particularly of indigenous women, where the traditional policy, the non-human rights-based approach, was simply to make more services available. What do women need to? What do we need to do to prevent maternal death? Well, let's just build more healthcare centers to deliver, so that women can have access to emergency obstetric care, etc., etc. Okay, fine. What was happening? They were building more health centers in rural areas. But nothing was improving. Women were still dying in huge numbers because nobody was going to those centers. Why was nobody going to those centers? Because the policies had not taken into account a critical issue from a human rights perspective, which is the cultural acceptability and the quality of the services being provided. Generally speaking, a human rights approach to these socioeconomic issues brings in a qualitative dimension. It brings in the cultural sensitivity dimension. And what was happening is that indigenous women, primarily indigenous women, were refusing to go to these healthcare centers because they were being treated in a language they didn't understand, and they were being treated in a way that was totally culturally inappropriate, being forced to go into childbirth in a manner that was not the manner that Mayan communities are accustomed to doing. So I hope that's an example. The rights-based approach, we did a lot of work with Guatemalan partners to pressure the authorities, the health authorities, to take into account these additional human rights dimensions, and I'm pleased to say that there have been improvements.
Heidi, and then the question from the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to give an example from Ethiopia, which is not a very easy country to promote political and civic rights, but where you can achieve development results is, for instance, in education. A very large majority of boys and girls now can go to primary school. I would say something like 85%. But it's a well-known fact that the last 15% doesn't get to go to school, and often because of disability. And when we started to give special attention in our programs on education in Ethiopian schools for disability, to try to integrate children into school, then yes, that had an immediate impact on their human rights and certainly on the level of development of the country.
Thanks, Heidi. You've been waiting very, very patiently at the back there, so please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Laura Sullivan. I represent an NGO called Action Aid International here in Brussels. I wanted to ask, I'm over here. This morning, next door, President Barroso spoke about the Millennium Development Goals and the role and the record of the EU in contributing to the MDGs. And he talked a lot about development aid. He talked a lot about the fact that the Lisbon Treaty puts it down that poverty eradication is the central goal of development policy. And both of those things are resoundingly positive. However, he didn't talk about the other side of the balance sheet, which is the non-aid policies that completely undermine people's rights in the developing world and anywhere in the world. And I just wonder, in terms of the other issue in the Lisbon Treaty, policy coherence for development, how can that now be brought into the discussions around the post-2015? How can that now be brought into Europe's efforts to bring a human rights-based approach into its programming, but also not just looking at the money we give to reinforce people's rights, but also the policies we have, such as trade and energy, biofuels targets that are undermining people's right to food. How do we turn that around to really reinforce economic, social and cultural rights? Thank you.
Who wants to bite that apple? Heidi, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry for being too talkative, but this is really my favorite subject because I think we're close to come to a situation where the EU development ministers, my successor and all the other fantastic people, they start to discuss other than strictly developmental issues in their ministerial meetings. And this is, I think, what is meant also with policy coherence for development, that the development ministers could have a discussion and dialogue with the trade ministers and discuss the development impact of that. And I think this work has to be very systematic, and I think we're close to succeeding in that. How to bring it into the post-2015 framework is probably more challenging, but I believe we have a very good ground to say that there will be much less that can be achieved if we don't pay attention to development impacts of all policies. And there is a place where this is going to be discussed, and that is the so-called Intergovernmental Working Party on Financing for Sustainable Development. And there's a Finnish co-chair.
Margaret.
Just to give, I think, another example, one of the key issues for the post-2015 agenda is the idea of public-private partnerships. One of the frameworks within which companies may be investing in developing countries, also for PPPs, are what are called investment agreements. I know ActionAid probably knows this very well, but I'll give the example. And these investment frameworks are a deal between different countries that you bring in investment and the investment is protected against expropriation, a number of other issues. So you see the bargain there. What has happened, though, is that those frameworks that are being used are past century frameworks. And so what's happening is governments are being constrained in the way, can be constrained by the terms of investment agreements in the way they regulate foreign investment coming in with respect to environmental, social, or human rights issues. And so one of the things that we should be sure to bring into the 2015 agenda is updating these international frameworks around investment agreements. Trade is another one, but around investment agreements. And interestingly, UNCTAD, which is one of the UN agencies, has been doing a lot of work to build sustainable development into investment agreements between governments and between regions, so that there are appropriate frameworks in place that allow governments to regulate business and have responsibilities on business to do their business in a responsible way.
Thank you very much, Margaret. We have a question from this lady here. There was a hand up here earlier. This lady, could I have the other microphone over here? Just keep your hand up, please, ma'am, so we can see who it is. Please go ahead, madam.
I would like to ask a question to all the four members in the panel.
Can I ask you to pick
my
one,
name
please?
is... But
can
pick
I ask
one.
you to pick one
well,
panelist,
anyone
please?
can answer then.
Okay.
I'm a member of the parliament from Bahrain. My name is Sausan Takawi.
Oh.
Democracy, human rights, nice words. We are asking for it. And as a member of the parliament, I'm asking for more rights for my people in my country. But when it reaches to the security of the country and using human rights to affect the security of the country, how can you define that if it is related to the external interference with under the name of human rights and committees of human rights, it will be affected the security of the country, then please tell me how we are going to deal with this situation. Thank you so much.
Who's volunteering on that one? Because you know I'm going to pick somebody. Okay, Madame Fazia.
I believe countries should run their business and should not be interfered. However, countries should be encouraged to keep the human rights in their agendas. Conditions are not appropriate to have conditions, but I, as a person, believe in human rights and would like to see that in my country, but also as a politician, I like to have my liberty to decide for my people and my country what I want to do. And I would like my partners, both in the West and in the East, to accept that we discuss issues and agree upon matters that are important to the development, which is connected to the human rights. Because as a government and as individuals, we all have rights to exercise. Thank you.
Thank you for juggling that really hot one. Very well. Thanks, Madame Fazia. I mean, I think in reality, if I can just address the point, I'm not sure that in reality any of these people on this panel would be well placed or the best placed people to address your issue. None of them are currently sitting in any global policy-making forum, even though some of them had, but currently not. We're not going to have a debate now. No. Yes, make a small point.
A very high position in government person came out with a statement earlier, says when it's related to the issue of the country, then no human rights will be taken into consideration. So that I would like to also to listen for them. Thank you.
In all fairness, and again, I don't want to enter a debate, I think that is a debate to be had with the individual who made the statement. I don't think that any of our panelists are currently placed to defend or make any conditional address in terms of that statement. And I think that that would be the fair way to go. But thank you very much. I think the point that you make is very well taken. I'm sorry. Ignacio, you want to say something? I've just spent 5 minutes. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Ignacio.
No, I mean, just to say we've... in our recent history, we've heard time and again security invoked as a justification for curtailing human rights. Think of the war on terror and the terrible abuses and curtailment of human rights that was justified in the name of national security, or the invasion of privacy that we're seeing now in the name of defending national security. My advice would simply be we must be very skeptical whenever we hear security used as an excuse to curtail human rights. Human rights law, human rights standards, which Bahrain, like many other countries, has signed and ratified, impose very strict limits on which rights can be limited and to what extent in the name of national security. Of course, there are genuine national security situations that may justify temporarily limiting freedom of association, but the limits have to be very. The limits must be strictly justified, they must be proportionate, they must be for a very legitimate reason, they must be time-bound. So there are standards about this. No government representative who is worthy of that role should be saying nonsense like security trumps human rights.
Thanks, Ignacio. Heidi, very brief response for you because we've got a lot of questions coming from the floor.
I think there is a case for human rights experts and professionals to try to address and approach governments who are using this scapegoat of security to curb human rights. And I'm aware that there are at least 100 students of the Venice Institute for Human Rights here, and I please go to the developing countries and talk to the governments that they have to understand what Ignacio has just said.
I think you've touched a very hot button there, so thank you very much. We have a question over here and then this lady over here. Sorry, can I just ask you, this lady's been waiting, sorry. This lady's been waiting. If I can just ask you just 1 second, please.
I am Begoña Iñarra from Africa Euro Faith and Justice Network. And we have heard about the investment agreement. And the bilateral investment agreements that the European Union and many other countries are signing, that gives to the companies the power to sue governments in case that the governments do legislation to protect the human rights or different aspects. So I don't think that those investment governments that the European Union is imposing in all the trade agreements, like the EPA's economic partnership agreements with the ACP and other countries, that those are a way of protecting human rights, but just on the opposite, they are a big danger to human rights and to the policy of human rights.
So the point, can I answer that to me?
Yes, please.
So I think that the point is that the frameworks need to be changed then, so they do. I think that we're seeing now the legacy of those old frameworks, old-fashioned frameworks that are there then for 20, these often have 20-year shelf life for some of these investment agreements. And so I think the key is that people are learning those lessons about the implications of those frameworks. And so hence the need to change the frameworks. If they're still needed to get foreign investment, the point is to make sure they're balanced, they have responsibilities for companies, and they allow the policy space for countries to develop their regulatory framework as appropriate. And as I said, I think recently there's been a lot of focus on helping governments figure out what those new sustainable development investment agreements should look like.
Thank you very much, Margaret. There was the lady with the microphone. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Inês Carreirinho from the European Masters in Human Rights and Democratization, Venice. I would like to go back to the topic on corporate responsibility for human rights. And once we have already talked about how this marriage is important to the post-2015 agenda, I would like to know what are your opinions on which avenues could these take, because now we have the guiding principles on business and human rights from the United Nations, the working group, but can we achieve in the future legally binding instruments or effective monitoring systems to effectively take enterprises and multinational companies into account for human rights violations? Thank you.
So I think there's, I think there will be coming a big discussion on thinking about a treaty on corporate accountability, but if it ever comes about, I think it's probably a long way off. So I think in the interim, there's a lot of different ways I think you can bring about corporate accountability. One of them is, again, trying to relate this to the post-2015 agenda. We spoke a little bit about these public-private partnerships. And I think, so there's ways of building in corporate accountability into those PPPs, whether it's PPPs, especially for the 2015 agenda, or any kind of PPP. I mean, Europe is full of public-private partnerships for building roads and energy infrastructure. And it's not rocket science about how you take human rights, which the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee in particular has done a very good job of breaking them down into their component parts. And you can build those into the frameworks, the regulatory frameworks or the contractual frameworks that companies are then obliged to comply with if they're providing public services. That's one way. Another way is, one of the things that's been called for in the 2015 agenda is corporate reporting, which is very useful because that gets information out into the public domain so people can act on it. But it's got to be more than just corporate reporting. I think some from the private sector has said, you know, that's the main avenue for accountability. That's an avenue, and it's an important one. But I think also countries are looking at their different criminal, civil codes and administrative law, and there can certainly be changes made at a smaller level in the interim that addresses the corporate accountability issue as well.
Thank you very much. There were some questions. Yes, I know you've been waiting for quite a while. There was another hand around here. Okay, please go ahead and remember to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Conor O'Neill. I'm a political science graduate from Trinity College, and I work in the European Parliament. This question is directed to Mr. Saiz. I welcome what you said about breaking down this so-called false dichotomy between civil and political rights and then economic, social and cultural rights. But do you think that there are problematic aspects when you do that as well? So, for example, with a so-called negative right like taking torture, in the instance of torture, it's very clear that there is a rights abuse. Someone is abusing that right, and you could see legal prosecutions taking place afterwards. But if you talk about some of the economic, social and cultural rights, these positive rights, if a government is failing to provide adequate education or housing, would you go as far to say that then that they are abusing the rights of their citizens? Is that a human rights abuse, or is that language too strong? Thank you.
No, it's a great question. Clearly, the evidence that you need, how you build the evidence in your second case is in a way more complicated than the first case. I should say, by the way, that there are positive and negative obligations across the range of rights. So there are positive obligations in civil and political rights, including in torture prevention. There are positive obligations as well as negative ones not to torture. But this is an area that we at the Centre have worked a lot on. How do you assess whether high levels of women dying in childbirth, for example, is a result of a violation of the government's human rights obligations, or to what extent is it just, you know, a bad situation? You need to piece together the argument very carefully. I mentioned the example of Guatemala earlier on. There, we needed to build the evidence that it was Guatemala's tax policies that were leading to, you know, abysmally high levels of maternal death. But we needed to make the argument. The argument didn't prove itself. So bit by bit, we assessed the policies from a human rights perspective. We assessed the resources and budget allocations from a human rights perspective to see whether there was discrimination in budget allocations. We looked at why the budgets were so small in the first place. So that took us back to tax policy. And then we looked at how the country was generating resources from whom, how fair was the government's tax base. It ended up being poor people who were contributing disproportionately to the public coffers through taxes. All this just to say it is a more complicated process to ascertain when when some economic and social rights have been violated. You can't say every case of a maternal death is a human rights violation. Legally speaking, it's not attributable to the state necessarily, but you have to trace that smoking gun in a way, or that causal chain is more detailed than it is in a case of torture.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Were there additional questions from the floor? Oh, wow. Okay, so we're answering your question. Oh, okay. Please go ahead.
My name is Natalie Lulic-Grozdanowski from the Croatian Foreign Ministry, Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Assistance Division. You have mentioned the marriage between the development and human rights pillars within the post-2015 framework. I would like to ask you to dwell on the three pillars, which I think are very much into a marriage perspective should be looked at, and that's peace and security, human rights and development. How do you see that human rights-based approach could contribute to the prevention of conflict and to the conflict negotiations, the peace negotiations, and the sustainability of a peace, that its attainability? In particular, looking at the in countries where there is no governance and no human rights basis already developed, how different business concessions which are being made during peace negotiations can be empowered by giving bigger focus to the importance and of protection of the human rights, how it could add value. I mean, whoever.
Okay, that's potentially a really long response. Yes, sir, I see you. That's potentially a really long response. So I'm going to take your question and break it up a little, if you don't mind. Madame, if you can perhaps guide us through the question of the conflict resolution and how one uses the question of human rights to find mechanisms that allow for sustainable peaceful solution rather than a recurrence of conflict. If I could ask you to address that element, and then perhaps if I can come to you for the other bit of the question. I think that gives us that covers most bases. Madame, please.
Thank you. I think conflicts, as I said, are always start. The basis for that is inequality and lack of accessing resources. And that's how people who feel that they are either undermined or their rights are abused start taking guns and fight for their rights. Therefore, to have a conflict resolution, you got in our case, for example, I'm coming back always in our case, we have a tradition where elders decide. And elders sit together for months and months and months, discuss the rights of each group or each tribe or each region, and what went wrong and how this started and the process took place. That's how we, in Somalia, in parts of Somalia, the conflict or the resolution took place through democratic, traditional process. And that's how, in many places of Somalia, peace is still sustainable. It is the resolution, the conflict resolution is based on rights of the tribes, rights of the groups, rights of the young and the elders, and all that. And it's all a process which takes long, and that's how peace is kept in this region of the world. Thank you.
Margaret, if I can come to you, and then you, Heidi.
So there's I think, an increasingly clear recognition that business can be both a trigger for conflict, but also particularly in post-conflict situations, if it's done properly, can help rebuild, be part of that process of rebuilding, because it gives people immediately what they're looking for, which is jobs and some economic income that's built around those businesses. So the key is then that both policymakers, but also the businesses themselves, recognize those triggers that businesses can be part of. And on the policymaker side, clearly there's the whole issue of allocation of resources, corruption, crony capitalism, that fuels conflict, and so that needs to be addressed. We're doing a lot of work, for example, in Myanmar at the moment, and this is a key issue in Myanmar of breaking that link between the old kind of crony capitalism and bringing in new, more responsible business. But there also then has to be clearly training of business about thinking through these issues, being very careful in being non-discriminatory in who you give jobs to, and realizing that there are some groups who have traditionally been discriminated against in conflict areas who may actually need a lot of extra training just to take that basic level job, but that's an important aspect of doing business in that area. Being careful about land acquisition issues. So there's a whole series of, and what's helpful now is that kind of training is now available, and for businesses that want it.
Thank you, Margaret. Heidi, if I can come to you, and then I've got 2 more questions to take from the floor.
I think the Somalia case, the negotiation between the elders of the society is quite an interesting example, and perhaps it should be practiced in other societies as well. And I was so pleased to see that the Finnish Church Aid was instrumental in putting that together. Now, I just wanted to say that I think it's vital to understand that we need to look at the post-2015 framework very much from the point of view of the so-called fragile states to which both Somalia and Myanmar belong, because that really shows the scale of the challenges and of those states that are now having a real opportunity to become a real democratic, inclusive state. But if that fails, the world will be much less secure.
Thank you very much, Heidi. This gentleman with the red tie.
En tout cas, merci de m'avoir donné la parole. J'appuie en tout cas cette parole sur 3 points. Le premier point, bon, je tiens d'abord à remercier donc, le panel. Le second point bon, consisterait effectivement à poser une question. Bon, sinon, j'ai oublié de dire, je suis Ibrahima Kamara, je suis ressortissant de la Côte d'Ivoire. Donc la question que j'aimerais poser porte sur, en fait, le P5. Donc, le P5 qui est en fait les 5 pays membres du Conseil de sécurité. J'aurais souhaité savoir si les 5 membres du Conseil de sécurité ont la même définition des droits de l'homme. C'est la première question.
Okay. Only one. I'm sorry, sir. We are under time. So I know you said you had 3 points. So, okay. So can you make them really, really short? Shorter than your first one.
Bon. Et la seconde question porte sur le triptyque État, droits de l'homme, prison. Autrement dit, est-ce que les droits de l'homme s'arrêtent à la porte des prisons ou non? Parce qu'on a le sentiment que dès l'instant où quelqu'un est détenu, les droits de l'homme ne s'appliquent pas, si tu veux, aux détenus. On voit les rapports du Conseil de l'Europe, de Strasbourg, qui chaque année fournissent effectivement pas mal de cas sur effectivement le non-respect des droits de l'homme dans les prisons par les États membres. Donc j'aimerais donc vous demander, est-ce que donc l'application des droits de l'homme s'arrête au seuil des prisons ou est applicable aussi aux prisonniers?
It was longer than the first one. Yes. I did hear that. Ignacio, can you take that? Do we need a translate? You're definitely going to have to translate for some of us.
There were 2 questions as I understood it. Correct me if I'm wrong. The first was whether the 5 members of the Security Council have the same understanding of human rights. I think you have to ask them. But I get the sense of the question, which is that the members of the Security Council behave as if human rights obligations do not apply equally to them as to less powerful states. I think that point is well taken. The second question was whether human rights stop at the prison door. In other words, whether human rights apply to prisoners. Of course, human rights do apply to prisoners, and much of the work of the human rights movement in its inception, of the modern human rights movement, has actually focused on prisoners' rights. Before working at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, I worked for 15 years at Amnesty International, which is a human rights organization founded to defend prisoners' rights, precisely because across the globe, prisoners' rights were routinely violated. What I would say now is that we need to pay the same attention that there is, because there are now lots of monitoring mechanisms to ensure that prisoners' rights are respected. Those mechanisms are very important, but we also need to look at other types of imprisonment, and I think poverty is a form of imprisonment. There are millions of people who are imprisoned in poverty, and those prisoners of poverty are today's forgotten prisoners that we need to ensure benefit from human rights as equally as all human beings.
Thanks, Ignacio. Vanessa, really, really short because we are out of time.
Yeah, my question is addressed to Mrs. Fawzia. What do you think, according to your experience, skills and tools women in developing countries should have in order to reach power and have political influence, especially if they are not affiliated to any political parties or political leaders?
Thank you, Vanessa. Madame Fawzia?
Quickly, I think education is the backbone of any development. Higher education is the backbone of any development. I therefore think any woman who wants to be part of a political entity or take part of politics in her country should be really well educated and also or have some education with experience and passion for politics and also the courage to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It's one of those conversations that granted there are a number of areas that we didn't have the opportunity to cover. I also recognize that I promised you a poll at the beginning and at the end, but unfortunately the electronic gremlins got the better of us, so we weren't able to conduct the poll. I apologize. If you guys invite me back next year, I may decide to do another poll. Thank you so very much for your attention. My name is Dumi Makhabu. If I could ask you please for a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And thank you so very much for being a really attentive and interactive audience. I know you didn't have the opportunity perhaps to tweet as much as you would have liked, but thank you very much for your attention. My name is Dumi Makhabu. Once again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Can you join us for a photo?
Can we go and stand there? Yeah.
I definitely want